The information featured in this program is general in nature and therefore should not be relied upon. Guests appearing on the program may have commercial arrangements with some of the companies mentioned. Before making any investment, insurance or financial planning decisions, you should consult a licensed professional who can advise whether your decision is appropriate for you.
Good evening and welcome to the property edition of Your Money, Your Call. It's great to have you back for another week of property information. I'm Margaret Lomas, and before I introduce you to my guest this week, let's take a look at the news. And challenging the myth that property will always appreciate, Reserve Bank of Australia Governor Glenn Stevens has warned people against expecting prices to always go up. At a recent speech to the Economic Society Australasian meeting and the Australian Conference of Economists in Hobart, Stevens said that people shouldn't assume that prices always rise, because sometimes they fall. Though the value of loan approvals over the past year rose by around 20%, Stevens noted that while above 2011 levels, housing loans as a proportion of housing credit outstanding is not particularly high on a long-term basis. He said that if the recent slowdown in house price growth continued, it would be a benefit to the economy. And it seems there's been a change in investor focus, and investor activity is now heating up in Queensland, according to new data from mortgage broker AFG. The proportion of mortgages arranged for investors in Queensland has increased by an impressive 5% this year, from 33.5% in January to 38.7% in June. While New South Wales is still in first place, investor interest in the state has declined by 7.5%. In Victoria, 36.6% of June loans were for investors, while investors accounted for 35.5% of loans in South Australia and 33% of loans in Western Australia. Now, we have much to get through tonight, and I need some good expertise to help me. So I've asked Ben Kingsley from Empower Wealth and Paul Rickard from Switzer to help me out this evening. It's a great night for not only those general questions, but also for anything to do with self-managed superannuation funds, having Paul on the panel this evening. So if you have a question for anyone on the panel, you should get in early by either calling us right now on 1300 30 34 35, or you can email it to me at property@skynews.com.au. Welcome to the program, and welcome to you both.
Good evening, Margaret. How are you?
Interesting, Paul, to see the investor focus is now shifting up toward Queensland, and of course news over the past 6 months, any expert that you speak to have been forecasting a bit of a slowdown in New South Wales and Sydney, and that Queensland was going to be the next hotspot. So are you surprised by the figures?
Look, not really. I think Queensland's coming off a very low base, and if we've seen the recent the data showing, you know, prices in Sydney over the financial year up about 15.4%, and I think Queensland was about 4% or 3.5%. So it's a low base that's been tougher up there. I think also the maybe the state government also has had a bit to do with it with some of their policies. So I'm not surprised Queensland's finally getting a bit of an uptick in interest.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting, Paul, because some of the figures to come out recently indicate that, for example, in Sydney, where the median house price is around the $770,000, the average family can afford only $620,000. So it's $150,000 over what the average family can afford. Up there in Queensland, the median house price is $480,000. The average family can afford $580,000. So there's still $100,000 to go before they even hit a point where people it's becoming less affordable for the average person.
Look, absolutely, and I think that's one of the challenges about investing in the Sydney market. I wouldn't underestimate also the influence state governments have eventually getting their budget settings right. And look, I'm not trying to make a case for the Queensland government, but they've certainly done a bit more to encourage that market, and I think that's perhaps why you're starting to see a bit of a pick-up in interest in looking at Queensland.
Absolutely. And Ben, Glenn Stevens says that sometimes property prices fall. Of course that's true, and people tend to miss that. I certainly know many investors who have bought properties that have subsequently declined in value. Why does it happen?
Look, it happens, Margaret, because we go through cycles. And those property cycles are different in each state economy, And so what we actually see is when the economic activity is going well in a certain area and we've got population growth and good economic activity, we start to see some pressure on the housing in that location. But at some point in time, that momentum runs out and we start to see a slowing. And sometimes when you see that slowing, maybe some of the prices have overheated and gone that little bit further up, so they can potentially come down, plateau or stay flat for a while.
We see that happen when we see FOMO kicking in. Of course, I don't know if you know what FOMO is, or if you know what FOMO is, Paul.
Always keen for a new acronym.
Okay. Well, you have to have kids who are either very late teens or early 20s to know FOMO.
I should qualify.
Well, you should know then. It's fear of missing out, FOMO. And of course what happens particularly with investors is that you start to get some good news stories around an area, it filters through, and by the time everybody's jumping on the bandwagon, it's clearly too late. However, people get this fear of missing out, and we've seen this happening in Sydney. I think definitely a lot of the recent sales in the western suburbs are going to be to people who find in 6 months' time that they either have a very flat price or even it's fallen a little.
It's going to be an income story and that affordability story again. So what I'd be saying to anyone who's looking to invest in the Sydney and the western suburbs of Sydney, you really want to take that opportunity to understand exactly where affordability is and the type of asset you're buying. I'd be tipping to all investors in that market to try and stay certainly below the median in that local area. If you can get around 10 or 15% below, you'll compression risk yourself out of that. If you're buying at the established benchmark pricing in that area thinking you've got to buy the big and ritzy asset out there, I think you might do your dough.
And probably nowhere out there where you'll get 10 to 15 under median value at the moment because it's still a bit of a frenzy, but let's see what happens. And Daniel wrote this week looking for some ways to boost his yield, and he asks, hi guys, what are some simple but effective ways to increase property value to turn a negatively geared property to a neutral or positively geared property? Look, I think before we answer this one, we need to just explain to the viewers the difference between negative and positive gearing. And one of the things that people very often mistake is the fact that negative gearing and positive gearing is not a strategy, it's a tax outcome. It's simply a tax outcome. So when you gear to buy property, it means you borrow to buy it. And the outcome will either be negative, as in it costs you more to hold than you get, or positive, as in you get more than you actually have to pay out. Now that could be because you get some good tax breaks, or it could be because it's got high rental yield. The thing about it is that two people can buy exactly the same property, and it could be negatively geared for one and positively geared for the other, depending on their personal tax rates, how much rent they can negotiate on that property, how well they can negotiate their interest rate with their bank. So all of those things can impact whether it's positive or negatively geared. Now that we've established that, Paul, what are some simple ways that someone can boost the cash flow, I guess, is a better way to...
Well, the other thing to say about negative and positive gearing, I prefer to be positive geared than negative geared, because negative gearing means I'm losing money.
Yes, that's very true.
And the way I make it up is I have to make it back in the capital, so I'd rather have positive income out of a property. Look, obviously the simple way is to actually, how do you increase the rent? How do you make the property more appealing to the tenant so that if you're changing the tenant, you can get a higher rent? And probably the simplest way is those sort of basic things. You know, what's the presentation like? What is the garden like, or the outdoors look like? Can you do a simple coat of paint just to, you know, suddenly make it a little more appealing, and then you can take a further look at the kitchen and do the next set of things. But it's largely about, in this aspect, assuming you can't change things like your interest rate, is how do you actually extract a higher rent from the property? Maybe you need perhaps to think about changing your agent. They might have better access to potentially higher paying tenants.
And maybe you can change your interest rate, because a lot of people don't realise you can go back and negotiate.
Well, you can. I mean, and the market is so competitive at the moment, and there are 100+ lenders out there, not just the four major banks.
Absolutely. You know, we've been actually going back to lenders with existing clients and actually screwing them down for even better rates while they still hold the loan even for some of our clients. So it can actually be done, and that would be a biggie as well. Now, Ben, of course, one of the things I think we need to point out for the viewers here is that if your investment property is in an area where vacancy rates are increasing, then even that cosmetic renovation may not make a big difference to your rent. You're probably going to need to be dropping your rent in those cases.
Potentially. I mean, you want to make the asset as presentable as possible. You know, if you are competing against lots of properties, having a clean, fresh-looking asset is going to give you a better chance to let it out than actually not. Yeah, a couple of the other points that I wanted to raise here, Margaret, were in terms of you can rent by the room. Now, that's a pretty aggressive strategy, or rent by the bed. Make sure your property manager knows and explains the risks and in terms of doing that. But I know certainly around university areas and so forth, they potentially rent by the room as opposed to renting a standard house out.
It sounds wrong, doesn't it? Rent by the room. It sounds like, you know, one of those legal things almost. Rent by the hour.
True, Margaret. One of the other big points that I wanted to make here is if you buy a property and time the acquisition correctly, and that property grows in value quickly, you'll find that your rents will increase quickly as well. I think a lot of people don't understand that if you time the asset selection well, you can actually get that increase in rent pretty quickly because the asset's growing and so is the rent. And that means that the property could actually turn positively geared quicker because you've bought in a great location.
Yes.
That you've got that uplift and the rent coming behind it.
Yes, I've always said that those property experts who say that market timing doesn't matter, it's time in the market, are those ones who are trying to sell you a dud property that needs time in the market to grow. And market timing definitely can make a big difference. So just learning, Daniel, when the best time is to buy. Buying into a market that is showing that it's about to have values increase happening first will often then pull your rent up. A couple of other little things you can do as well, depending on the size of the block and the state you're in. If you're in New South Wales or in WA, you could add a granny flat even. Often a $100,000 spend can add $200 and $300 a week to that rent return. And I've seen 5% yield properties boosted up to 8 and 9% with that granny flat, depending on whether or not that is allowed in the state that you own that property. There are some other things. If it's in a hot climate, maybe air conditioning can add some rental return as well. So there are a couple of ways around it. Have a look if you've got any really big rooms on whether or not you can split one and make an extra bedroom. That can be done often cheaply, and an extra bedroom will often bring some extra rent as well. So start to think outside the 9 dots. There's certainly plenty of little things that you can do to the property that will attract a higher rent return as long as you're in the right market to begin with. Well, it's great to have you with us tonight. Don't forget that every question asked tonight has the chance to get a hold of a copy of one of my books. Now just phone or email, and if your question is chosen, I'll send you a copy of my book, The 20 Must-Ask Questions for Every Property Investor. And if you're ready to buy this book, we'll make sure that you ask the right questions to uncover all those growth drivers. Call us now on 1300 30 34 35 or email property@skynews.com.au with a question, and then make sure you watch at the end of the show to see if we choose you. It's time now for us to take a short break. Don't go away. When we come back, we'll take some more calls and we'll also answer your questions. I'm glad that you stayed with us. I'm Margaret Lomas, and this is the property edition of Your Money, Your Call. Now, joining me tonight is Ben Kingsley from Empower Wealth and Paul Rickard from Switzer. We're waiting on your calls to 1300 30 34 35 or your emails to property@skynews.com.au. Phil, you're from Sydney. Welcome to the program, Phil.
Oh, hi, Margaret. Thank you for taking my call.
You're welcome. How can we help you?
Cool. So I've got two questions. So basically, I'm looking for my second investment property area, and I was looking into two areas within Adelaide. So both the north in terms of Elizabeth, as well as the south in terms of that Hackham area.
Yes.
With Hackham, obviously, it has a bit of a higher buy-in rate compared to Elizabeth, and a bit lower rental yield compared to Elizabeth as well. And just based on the research I've done, I've kind of saw that with the south, that has the transport infrastructure being built in, and with Elizabeth I see like manufacturing jobs are decreasing, but also the government jobs and defence jobs are increasing in that area. And I just want to get your thoughts in terms of what the the growth prospects in that area, in those areas are, as well as what you think of overall the Adelaide market in terms of the other major cities in Australia.
Okay, that's great, and you've certainly done a lot of research already yourself. Now, who would like to tackle this one about Adelaide? Who knows Adelaide well?
It's not one of the areas that I would normally go into at the moment, so I'll probably sit back and take some notes from you guys.
Okay, Paul, how about
That's
you?
throwing it right over to me. Again, it's not an area I know really well. I suppose I must make one comment that obviously if you've done your research, I think is excellent. think the other thing I'd say is maybe, look, if I had a choice between the rest of Australia and Adelaide, it's probably I'd be thinking about somewhere outside Adelaide. That's just my gut feel. It's a very Sydney-centric perspective, but the data seems to bear that out as well, so I'd just throw that into the conversation.
Okay. Look, let me tell you a little bit about Adelaide, and while much of Adelaide is sitting a little flat at the moment, the two areas that you've chosen are the two ones that have the most growth out of all of Adelaide, and that's because the population is growing faster in those two areas than anywhere else. A lot of people are a little bit worried about the Elizabeth area because of the closure of the Holden plant in another 2 years' time. And I guess if you think that all of Elizabeth works in the Holden plant, then you've got something to worry about. But we aren't talking about a country town somewhere where everyone in that suburb works in one industry or even in for one employer. In fact, the people who work in the Holden plant come from all over Adelaide, and so the closure of the Holden plant won't directly affect Elizabeth as much as people think they are. And as you've so rightly pointed out, we are seeing a big increase in the defence forces up there in the northern suburbs, and so a lot of those people are starting to look at these sometimes older homes on big blocks. The other thing about the area is there's a fabulous new town plan that actually allows you to buy anything over about 600 square metres and then subdivide it down into 2 and 3 row houses, and you can get some really good development for the future. So I think you'll get some really good buys up in Elizabeth at the moment because people are fleeing that market, and you're going to be able to buy in for 150 or maybe even less in some cases, and you're going to see about a 7% rental yield with an option to then develop down the track as we start to see the panic about the Holden plant go away and we start to see growth again. There's certainly plenty of government spending up in the Adelaide area. Having said that, down in Hackham, we're seeing a lot of transport infrastructure going in, the duplication of the freeway, the train line down into Seaford. It's already affecting the Aldinga Beach market, which means that the stuff closer in Hackham, Huntfield Heights, Seaford Rise, Seaford Downs, Christie's Beach, Christie Downs, we're seeing that really cop the brunt of all the growth and all the interest. Slightly lower rental yields at about 5.5% there, slightly higher buy-in prices, you pointed out, in around the early 2s, 220, 230, but plenty of opportunity to grow. If it were me, I would just be finding something I like in both areas and negotiating hard on both and going with whichever one you get the best price on. Both of those areas are slated for growth. Both of them will outperform much of Adelaide simply because they've got those growth drivers and they're coming off that very, very low base at the moment. And while you're waiting for that growth to occur, it is going to look after itself and most likely be a positive cash flow investment as well, which can be really, really good for you too. So, now just with regard to that Holden plan, it's an interesting discussion point, Paul, because I liken it to Newcastle and when BHP closed and everybody figured Newcastle would be dead. And of course it's gone on from strength to strength since then.
It certainly has, and I think Newcastle was able to find a lot of other industry, and actually people realised that Newcastle actually was a pretty pretty place to actually go and have a holiday. Exactly. And also have conventions and all sorts of things that it went into.
Yes.
I'm perhaps not as optimistic on Adelaide, more so because I don't think the macroeconomic settings are perhaps right down in South Australia. But as you say, it's very affordable, and that doesn't mean you can't find some outstanding bargains, particularly if, look, I agree with you, I don't think the Holden plant in Elizabeth is going to do that much because you find these things just don't have that bigger impact when, you know, in historical sense. So.
Absolutely.
But I'd be perhaps, my view about looking outside is more based upon what are the longer term settings in general.
The economic settings, absolutely, and I thoroughly agree. Well, we're off for a break, but if you do have a question for us, call us now, and you might get a copy of my book, The 20 Must-Ask Questions for Every Property Investor, if we read out your question and then select you. Call us now on 1300 30 34 35 or email property@skynews.com.au with a question, and make sure you watch at the end of the show to see if we choose you. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Your Money, Your Call. This evening I have Ben Kingsley from Empower Wealth and Paul Rickard from Switzer doing a great job answering your questions. So call now on 1300 30 34 35 to join the queue, or you can email us on property@skynews.com.au. Amy from Melbourne, welcome to the program, Amy.
Hi, Margaret. Thank you.
You're interested in Moreton Bay.
I am very interested in Moreton Bay, and my question is twofold. I'm just wondering, firstly, if anyone on the panel has had an opportunity to look at the new draft planning scheme for the region and if they had any thoughts on that. And secondly, what anyone's views were on whether Redcliffe or Strathpine offer, which one offers better opportunities, investment opportunities, given that both will be activity centres for the region.
Yes, exactly. Is anyone familiar with this? Of course, Moreton Bay, north of Brisbane there, takes in Redcliffe, Deception Bay, into Strathpine, Caboolture at the top end, down through Morayfield. Ben, you seem familiar with the area?
Look, I love a good strategic plan. I haven't actually seen this one. I'm very familiar with the area in terms of, I've had a look at this area probably about 4 or 5 years ago and had a look at Deception Bay and that whole area, and just saw that it was naturally going to have a flow-on or wave rider effect into that particular area. When I look at these types of strategic plans, I'm really interested in what type of lifestyle drivers it's going to bring, what type of amenity it's going to bring, because let's face it, water is a natural amenity, and us humans, we love the emotion that attached to the water. In terms of those areas, I'm anti-apartments in those areas, any type of medium or high density. I love other people buying them, but I don't like my clients buying them because it brings that critical mass to support the restaurants and the lifestyle drivers. So they'll be the things I'll be looking for in terms of the level of density in the area. But I'll be looking at, again, the classic case of that sort of ugly duckling wave rider type strategy where I'm buying some of the old, more established homes on a good footprint of land. And if you're getting in that sort of lower than median value, but a good footprint, that could be a consideration in those areas.
What do you think?
Look, I don't know much about Moreton Bay, the regional planning scheme. I just have a concern to make sure that the infrastructure is really locked in. And, you know, governments make lots of promises. They have fantastic schemes, and regional planning schemes are right up there in terms of, you know, great ideas. But just how committed is the funding to actually put the infrastructure that's going to be needed to make it a real go?
Absolutely. Look, it's certainly a growing region up there, and now with the Bruce Highway extensions there, the fabulous road works. It's very quick back into Brisbane. It's basically suburban Brisbane. The interesting thing is, in my opinion, Strathpine has already had a lot of attention up there, and it led the charge on top of Kalanga to be able to really grow in value, and that occurred around about 6 or 7 years ago. Now, it went a little hot for a while there, and it's had a little period of correction, and the one area inland that didn't, and of course Moreton Bay is a massive big shire, the one area that didn't get dragged along by all of that was actually Morayfield, and Morayfield was always the poorer cousin, always the one that people didn't really want to buy in. It was the one where there was some housing commission, which has now been sold down. So I'd be more inclined to look at Morayfield because it's close to Strathpine, where those activity centres are going to be taking place and where they're going to be built, yet it doesn't already have that higher price ticket. It's still very much in that lower price ticket. Now, the same thing can be said about Redcliffe and Deception Bay. Redcliffe, again, people get really surprised when I say, you know, Redcliffe is the area that people want to live in, because years ago it was kind of like what Balmain in Sydney was 50 years ago, where no one really wanted to live there, but now, of course, it's shrugged that off a long time ago. Redcliffe was like that. Everybody said when the bridge went through it would go crazy. It didn't necessarily go crazy when it went through, but it started to grow. People became more interested in it. It's just a really lovely peninsula, and when new people go there, they can't understand what all the fuss is about and why nobody liked it. Now, Deception Bay is the poor cousin coming through. It's still a coastal area. It's close enough to those activity centres. It's just off the main highways that come up from the northern suburbs of Brisbane there, yet for some reason it's still quite low price, particularly if you can come a couple of streets back from the coast there, you can get some really good bargains, and I'd be more inclined to have a look at those two areas than the two areas that you're talking about, which already have the interest and has already had the growth, but has exactly the same growth drivers as those two poorer cousins. Well, while we head off for a break, you need to head to the phones, because every question is in the running to get the book, The 20 Must-Ask Questions for Every Property Investor. Now, call us now on 1300 30 34 35 or email us on property@skynews.com.au. It's great to have you with us this evening. I'm Margaret Lomas, and helping me tonight is Ben Kingsley from Empower Wealth and Paul Rickard from Switzer. Now, if you have a question for anyone on the panel, call us now on 1300 30 34 35 or email us on property@skynews.com.au. Now, just before we do go to callers, if you're a regular viewer, you will have seen our regular guest, Michael Tees, on this show and also on the weekends as my legal expert on property success. Now, this Wednesday, Michael is going to swim the English Channel to raise money for Lifeline. It would be fabulous if we can all get behind Michael by donating, and you can do so at michaeltees.com, which is right there on the screen for you, michaeltees.com. And also make sure that you read his amazing blogs about his epic journey. He's been keeping track of what he's been doing so far, and it's fascinating reading. Let's get behind Michael and help him to swim that English Channel on Wednesday. Tony from Sydney, how can we help you, Tony?
Hi, Margaret. My daughter has a one-bedroom unit. It's quite a new unit. It's only 6 months old in Camperdown in Sydney, near the university.
Yes.
And the hospital, and she was thinking of coming back home to live for 6 months or 1 year just to get the extra income to help pay the mortgage off. And she was wondering whether it was better to actually rent it out furnished or unfurnished for that period, and what the pros or cons were.
Okay, it's a very, very good question. And look, my temptation is to tell Tony that, you don't let your kids move back in when they've moved out. And, it's not your job to help her pay the mortgage off. However, Tony, you're clearly a much nicer parent than I am, because I wouldn't be having the kids come back in. But, Paul, it's an interesting question about furnished or unfurnished, because some areas good and some areas not such a good idea.
Look, in that area, Camperdown, obviously Sydney University and other colleges around it, it's a pretty tough line ball question. I think there's going to be a market for furnished, and because you've got overseas students and many others who are after that type of unit. And look, if you could do it for 6 months and you can probably get the bonds large enough and you can make sure it's the right tenant, it's probably okay. If you've got any concerns, then a lot of people have had a pretty bad experience in renting properties furnished.
Yes. And Ben, what about the fact that it is near the hospital? I wonder about short-term letting for people who have got a sick child in the hospital or sick people in the hospital.
Definitely. On the scheme of it, it looks actually like a smart idea. The only way, Tony, you're going to know is just talk to a couple of good property managers in the area, and they will give you an idea. Certainly from the colleges and the universities' point of view, that's going to be a timing thing. So at the start of the year, absolutely, something offering a fully furnished unit for country folk who are moving to the city to start their university degree makes perfect sense, and mid-year term starts, those types of things. But if you're starting outside of terms, maybe that furnished apartment might work for the uni, but it might work for the hospital. So I just think it's a quick phone call to 2 or 3 good property managers in the area and ask their views. They're on the ground. They know where the demand is in real time. They'll give you the best outcome.
Absolutely. And, it's a good talking point to remember that not always will furnish or furniture improve rents. It depends on where the property is. Most people in just a normal suburb will want to bring their own furniture, and that can be hard to let out a furnished unit. I had one in Neutral Bay for a while, and we had to remove the furniture to get people in there. Otherwise, people weren't renting it out. But sometimes if you're in areas where people are either commuting or, maybe they've come to live there to work and they don't normally stay there, which could definitely happen in Camperdown. With the hospital, you've got a huge hospital staff who could be looking for that furnished unit. Find out some outlets for renting it out, maybe through the hospital, maybe through the university, and maybe that's a great way to get in. A little hint for your daughter as well: if she's moving out of that because she's been living in it, tell her not to stop the contents insurance, because units are only insured by the body corporate for the building alone and nothing inside, so she does need to keep that insurance going while she's there. Talk to somebody about some landlord's insurance. If she's renting it out short term or to university students, there's often a greater risk, so she needs some good landlord's insurance for that one as well. Now, Jason is wondering about how much to spend on a property, and he writes, I love the show. Thank you very much, Jason. I had a question in regards to purchase price for properties for someone starting on their property portfolio. What are your thoughts about the amount of money spent on a property? For example, should I buy one $500,000 or two $250,000 property? With all things being equal, would a portfolio be better to have a large number of smaller properties or a smaller amount of larger properties in their portfolio? couple of things we need to get straight first of all. The property itself isn't necessarily bigger because you pay more, and at 500,000 and at 250,000, all things aren't equal.
No.
So that's very important that we point that out. It's not like you're saying, well, I've got two identical properties and I can spend either 500,000 on a bigger one or 250 on a smaller one. That kind of price differential gives us two entirely different propositions, Paul.
Yeah, look, it's a really interesting question. I mean, normally for investors, I'd say that because of transaction costs in actually buying a property and the costs involved in also selling a property, so both in and out, you'd actually tend to favour, you know, the larger property as opposed to the sort of the two different properties at $250,000 each. The converse argument is, of course, that things like land tax, particularly if you're looking at in the state, you know, generally most states have an exemption around about that $300,000 to $400,000 level. And land tax in a state like New South Wales, you know, is 1.6% going up to 2%. So, you know, if you buy a $500,000 property in New South Wales, you pay land tax. You buy two, you know, if you bought one at $250,000 property in New South Wales and another one, say, in Victoria, you probably end up paying no land tax. So the transaction costs and land tax are sort of two things you've got to weigh up. I'd love to know also if there's any statistics about which is actually better.
Of course, there are some other things to consider too, Ben, and I always think about the fact that, you know, one lot of 500 or 600,000 is buying a single asset, and for a brand new investor, you know, higher risk of having your entire asset with no income because of vacancy. You know, if one is vacant, then the whole lot of your investment's gone. Whereas if you're buying the two, you're not only diversifying, but, you know, you're managing that vacancy risk a little better as well. Yeah,
it still amazes me, Margaret, in terms of how, I mean, I do this for a living. I sit down and I build property investment strategies. That's what I do with clients every day. And it's an often question that I get asked quite a lot. And my view is it's all in the numbers. And a lot of people, it still surprises me that they don't actually have an idea of the investment returns that they want to achieve. They just think, get me the best outcome, you know, rather than sort of saying, okay, well, what, you know, as an advisor, we've got to set those benchmarks, we've got to set those targets. So coming back to that question, you know, default, I've always want to chase growth if I can get growth, but that's a story of surplus cash flows and equity. If I don't have that, then I might have to chase yield. So if I'm chasing a bit of yield, then I might go into those lower areas in terms of that 250 range. Because let's not be mistaken, $500,000 is pretty much the Australian median. So it's not as if we're buying anything spectacular for that particular money. But the argument might be, okay, do we go for a unit which minimises our land component, so minimise our land tax, but that unit might be brilliantly located and really a lot of strong growth drivers versus, as you say, Margaret, diversify and hedge your risk bet. And so that's an interesting question, but for everyone it's unique, and that's probably my message to the viewers.
And you know, Jason, I'll just throw the cat amongst the pigeons a little bit further here and say to you that the biggest mistake I think you're making is even thinking about price at this point in time. The best property might be $350,000 at the moment, and you should never be driven to buy property by its price. Because if you're driven by its price, you're going to be looking for a property in your price range, and you won't be thinking about everything else that makes a good property. What we need to consider first of all is where the next hotspots are, and then we want to have a look at why they're hotspots and whether we've missed it. And if we work out that the growth drivers are there and we haven't missed it, then we see what it's going to cost us to buy there and what the yield is going to be, and then work backward and see if that matches the money we've got and the yield we need, and whether or not the growth is coming up soon. Every investor should be trying to buy a property that has the best possible growth for the best possible cash flow that they can afford. So you need to first of all find out where you're going to buy. You've got so much work to do before you even begin to think about whether you buy 1, 2 or 10, or whether you buy expensive properties or cheap properties. Expensive properties fail and cheap properties fail. Expensive properties do well and cheap properties do well. The point here is you've got to find the area that's going to do well first and learn how to do that, and then work out if it's in your price range or if you've got to keep looking for something that is in your price range. Thanks for being with us. We're off for a break, but when we return, you'll have another chance to ask your questions simply by calling us on 1300 30 34 35 or emailing us on property@skynews.com.au. Welcome back to Your Money, Your Call. I'm Margaret Lomas, and joining me tonight on the show is Ben Kingsley from Empower Wealth and Paul Rickard from Switzer. Now, if you have a question and you'd like to be in the running to get a copy of one of my books, call us now on 1300 30 34 35 or email us on property@skynews.com.au. Cam from Melbourne, welcome to the program, Cam.
Thanks very much, Margaret. Thanks very much for taking my call tonight.
You're welcome.
Thank you. My question tonight is to get your opinion about my investments portfolio specifically. I'm wondering whether to give more weight to shares or to invest in property as part of an SMSF. Currently, my wife and I have a total of about $110,000 in shares in the major banks and Telstra, and about 45 grand each in our super account. We are thinking of using those funds to create SMSF. What would be better, a self-managed super fund in shares or in property, or would you recommend a combination of both?
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Now, Paul, unfortunately we're going to have to disappoint Cam a little, and we can't give him that kind of advice at all. We can't be telling him where he needs to invest his super funds because we know nothing about Cam, we know nothing about the time he has until retirement, his risk profile,
No, none of those things.
goals.
Yeah.
We know nothing. But what we can do is maybe talk generally about utilising self-managed superannuation funds for property.
Yeah, I think first thing I'd say, Cam, is generally I'd be wanting to have a little bit more in my self-managed superannuation fund before I thought about buying a property. Look, more so because most of the banks now are going to look for some sort of level of diversification. So the banks are sort of woken up a little bit, and they're going to say, look, we want to see what other income there is in your fund to support the cost of paying for the loan. So when you put money into superannuation, you can't get it out until, for most people, it's age 55, and that's going up to 60. So you've got to be cognizant about that. Buying property through a self-managed super fund is not something you do for a couple of years. It's actually a long-term investment, and because of the transaction costs and the cost in setting up the loan, you need to make sure it's a property that's got really good long-term growth. So therefore, making sure that you've got enough other assets in your super fund first so that the dividends and interest can support the interest costs on a loan is a really good idea. So therefore, you're never in any problem about your property inside your super fund. So that's what I'd be doing generally. I'd make sure I had a little bit more on it first before I thought about a property. But by then, if you've got the money in your fund, then by all means look at that as a strategy.
And keeping in mind the fact, of course, Paul, a lot of people don't realise that, first of all, they've probably only got enough money in super to buy one property, even if they're gearing that if they do get a loan to buy property and it grows in value, they can't leverage against that growth because each property can only be mortgaged once.
Yep.
There are limitations.
Yeah.
Not to mention compliance.
There are absolute limitations. I mean, the strategy about investing in property through your super fund is all about, you know, being able to get something into a capital gains tax-free state, which doesn't occur till you're 55 or for some people 60. So, you know, you've got to be thinking about the asset as a long-term asset. So it's got to be something you're very confident about. It's not just going to have a good running yield in the meantime, but is actually going to grow over the longer term. And so the risks that you've identified, Margaret, about, you know, single asset risk and getting the wrong property, you know, it's not always as rosy as perhaps as some people make it out to be. So that's one of the other things, and potentially, you know, get more money into your super fund. And if you do it, then if you have one property, you probably want to start to think about a second just for a bit of diversification risk.
Absolutely. Major from Sydney, how can we help you? I think you've got a question about Toowoomba.
I have indeed. I was sort of umming and ahhing about buying something in Brisbane, but somebody's come to me with a package of a couple of properties to have a look at. One's about 15 k's north of Toowoomba, and another one's about 15 k's south of Toowoomba, both new houses, and I'm sort of, on the face of it, they look good, especially the one in the south, which is a dual occupancy sort of property. I'm just wondering if you think it's still good value going forward.
Of course, Ben, I worry a little bit about this because while, of course, I'm a great advocate for Toowoomba, I'm going to be driving through there tomorrow on my way up to check out Dalby and Chinchilla, and I still think that there are plenty of fabulous, a great prognosis for the future in Toowoomba. I worry when people start talking to me about those house and land packages, particularly when it's 15 k's out of the place that we're talking about.
Absolutely, and this is a big warning sign for your major in terms of how you want to look at this. When someone says package, off-the-shelf solution, the paperwork looks good, the marketing collateral looks great, there's a lot of confident talking around the prospects of it. You need to understand the risks associated with a dual lock. In other words, there's a common firewall between the two properties. So who actually is taking the lease agreement out? I'd want to get that clarified. And most importantly, when someone is trying to sell you an opportunity, I would seek out independent advice. Just be mindful that they're not working necessarily in your best interest. They are a sales agent, okay, and they may be saying that there's no charge to you for the services they provide. That's okay, as long as they're disclosing how they're getting paid, and you also then go and make your own investigations as to what the value of the land in the area is worth and what the value of the asset at the end of the day is going to be. You may find that there could be a differential in terms of what a professional licence value will say the asset's worth as opposed to the contract price that they're offering their asset to you. Now that's an important message for anyone out there who's looking to buy off-the-shelf solutions. And Margaret and I, we agree. We sit on the board of the Property Investment Professionals of Australia, and we have absolutely no problem at all with people going out there and selling their wares, but just be mindful that they're obviously operating in your best interest, or are they, when you're looking to make those decisions.
And maybe what Ben's trying to say much more nicely than I would say it is that there are opportunists out there who whack $50,000, $40,000 on the top of these house and land packages, and that's their take on selling it to you. You know, you're in Sydney, you can't really get a good handle over whether or not you're getting a good buy. It looks good, of course it looks good, because they're not going to give you the glossy brochures that say, well, look, this is really a dodgy investment at the end of the day and you shouldn't be buying it. They're only going to say the good things in the glossy brochures. Just be very careful. There are, as Ben said, some very legitimate people, and they're the ones who will tell you this is how much we make out of this when we sell this to you. But there are others who will try to hide that and not disclose it, and it's going to be hidden by the fact that it looks okay on paper to you. Very often I find that if you go away and if that area is so good and you've asked the questions about that area, and I'd be a bit wary about going 15 k's out of Toowoomba at the moment, because I think Toowoomba is where you need to be, not 15 k's out of Toowoomba. But just be aware that if the area they're talking about is so good, very often buying a 1, 2 or 3-year-old property which still has big depreciation available on them means that that initial commission, any builder's premium, is all out of the way and paid by someone else, and you've got true market value. You know what a second-hand property is worth because it's what properties are selling for at that point in time. Very difficult in a brand new subdivision to establish true market value, and I've seen plenty of investors who are caught and get left holding the baby of an investment that costs them far too much, and down the track they really pay in more ways than one. Well, time's flying and we're taking a quick break, but when we return we'll answer more of your questions and emails. To have yours answered, simply call us now on 1300 30 34 35 or email us on property@skynews.com.au. It's a great night as usual here on Your Money, Your Call. My expert panel, Ben Kingsley from Empower World and Paul Rickard from Switzer, are doing a fabulous job. Now, you may have a question of your own, so don't ponder too long. Pick up the phone and call us on 1300 30 34 35 or email us on property@skynews.com.au. Now, Rosalind has written to us and she has said, you spoke about looking for drivers when planning to buy a house. Please, can you tell me what these are, or is this available in one of the books that you also talk about? Of course, I always talk about my books, and of course the growth drivers are available in the books. But we can sum up some of them, Ben, for Rosalind.
Yeah, we can, Rosalind. What we're talking about in regards to growth drivers is, you know, as investors, we're price takers in most markets. In other words, the market's controlled by owner-occupiers, and owner-occupiers buy an emotion. Okay, they want to live in a certain area for the lifestyle element, the status element, whatever it may be. Now, what we try and study from an investment point of view is where are those growth drivers and why are people wanting to live there? So the lifestyle elements, the proximity to major employment centres, the infrastructure and how quickly they can get to those major employment centres. They're the things that I'd be looking for when I'm studying an area. You know, correlate those with incomes and average age and the propensity for that income to grow, and you're potentially looking at a good model for growth over time.
That sounds like a great lot of circumstances there to look for. Paul, would you add anything to that?
To add to that, I mean, some other, perhaps just taking it up a level, look at some of the macroeconomic factors such as, population growth. What is the government doing around infrastructure and investment? What's employment growth doing in a suburb or a town? I mean, there are some towns that just simply are not going to grow, and therefore it's very hard to think you're going to get property price growth. So have a look at some of the other factors that are going to affect an area or a region, and then perhaps when you look at the regional factors, you can then narrow it down into a suburb or street or whatever you need to look at.
And that's why they're both experts, because they're giving you really the good dirt on all of that. What I'll add to that is, in addition to, is population growing? Is it growing faster than the national average? Because that means that growth should come sooner rather than later, as long as there is also plenty of diversified employment opportunities in that area. An area can start growing because of population and then shrink again just as quickly if there aren't those employment opportunities in the area. Look also at the median household income. I found that where a median household income is growing faster than inflation over the last 3 census periods, then that often means that the area is becoming a little bit more affluent. And as people start to trade up in their properties, but they're staying in an area because all that infrastructure is there, the schools and the shopping centres and the private schools and parks and sporting facilities, then people would trade up within their area, and suddenly this starts to put pressure on the prices within the area. Finally, no new land. I like to buy in areas that have got all of the things the panel has talked about tonight, but a real shortage of new land, so that the pressure comes well on those established properties. Whenever there's lots and lots of new land releases and lots of house and land packages, then people will buy those first before they go back onto the established housing, and it'll take a long time for growth to occur in those areas. Well, that wraps up this week's episode. Come back again next week for another great show with Brad Beer from BMT and Andrew Wilson from Australian Property Monitors. Thanks to Ben Kingsley from Empower Wealth and Paul Rickard from Switzer. They'll be back again very soon. Thanks also to our callers, and this week the question of the week goes to Jason. Jason, you wanted to know whether to buy a $250,000 property or a $500,000. If you email me at yourmoneyyourcall@destiny.com.au, I will send you your book. 2 very important things coming up. The Home Buyer Show in Sydney, 18, 19 and 20 July. Free tickets available now from my website, destiny.com.au, so be sure to grab yours. And, of course, Michael T's English Channel Swim on Wednesday. Go to michaeltees.com to donate and follow his journey. Thanks for being with us. I'll see you again next week.
The information featured in this program is general in nature and therefore should not be relied upon. Guests appearing on the program may have commercial arrangements with some of the companies mentioned. Before making any investment, insurance or financial planning decisions, you should consult a licensed professional who can advise whether your decision is appropriate for you.